That's it! I've had enough of your lip! You are under arrest!
On what grounds do you believe you have the authority to place that citizen, or me, under arrest?
The autumn sun ascended over the city of Northwood, its light the color of pale honey, casting long, skeletal shadows from the skeletal branches of oak trees. From his vantage point at Skyline Overlook, Police Chief Elias Vance watched the city stir to life. Below him, the grid of streets was a circuit board coming online, with the slow pulse of early morning traffic beginning to flow. At 52, his hair was more salt than pepper, and the lines around his eyes were etched not by age alone, but by the weight of 2 decades spent navigating a world he had once only seen from the outside. He sipped his black coffee from a simple ceramic mug, the warmth a small comfort against the morning's crisp chill. This was his ritual, a moment of quiet observation before the relentless demands of his position began. It was a chance to see his city not as a collection of districts and crime statistics, but as a living, breathing organism he was sworn to protect. Yet on mornings like this, when the air was clear and the world seemed deceptively calm, the ghost of another morning would often visit him. It was a memory that lived not in the hazy realm of nostalgia, but in the marrow of his bones, a persistent, low-frequency hum of injustice. It had its own sensory triggers, the specific glint of sunlight off a polished car, the sterile scent of fresh leather, the sharp metallic click of a locking mechanism. 20 years. An entire lifetime ago for some, but for Elias, it was a foundational trauma, the dark soil from which his entire career had unexpectedly grown. He had been a different man then, an architect, 32 years old, full of the quiet confidence that comes from seeing one's blueprints rise from the earth as tangible structures of steel and glass. He had believed in logic, in angles, in the predictable physics of the world. He believed that success was a shield, that accomplishment rendered a man visible and distinct. He had been wrong. The memory was a sharp, unwelcome image. His own hands, calloused from drafting pencils and site visits, cuffed behind his back. The rough texture of asphalt against his cheek. The hot shame that flooded him as people drove by, their faces a blur of fleeting curiosity. He had been pulled from his own car, accused of stealing it, for one simple, unalterable reason. He fit a description. He was a black man in a nice car in the wrong neighborhood, an equation that, in the biased arithmetic of the officers who had stopped him, could only equal criminal. That day had shattered his belief in the world's inherent logic. It taught him that perception, however flawed, could be a more potent force than reality. It had ignited a fire in him, not a wild, vengeful inferno, but a controlled, focused flame. A determination to wear the same uniform that had been used to humiliate him, but to wear it as a mantle of genuine service. A promise that he would spend his life ensuring no one else felt the helplessness he had felt on that sun-drenched curb. He finished his coffee, the last dregs bitter on his tongue. The city below was now fully awake, a complex machine of 1,000,000 moving parts. He was one of those parts now, a central cog. He was no longer the man pinned to the ground. He was the man who set the policies, who trained the officers, who held the ultimate responsibility for the department's soul. He had traded his drafting table for a desk cluttered with reports, his blueprints for strategic plans to combat crime and rebuild community trust. And most days, he believed he was making a difference. But the ghost of that morning was always there, a silent partner in his office, a reminder of the fragility of justice and the ever-present danger of a uniform without integrity. He put the empty mug in the holder of his unmarked sedan and started the engine. It was time to go to work. The city was waiting, and as he knew better than anyone, a single moment, a single bad decision could change a person's world forever. The drive from the Overlook to the Northwood Police Department headquarters was usually a 20-minute exercise in mental preparation. Elias would listen to the local news, mentally cataloging the day's priorities, his mind shifting from the philosophical to the pragmatic. But this morning, The routine was shattered by a voice from the police radio integrated into his vehicle's dashboard. He kept the channel open out of habit, a way to keep his finger on the city's pulse. Most of the chatter was mundane: traffic stops, minor disputes, the familiar rhythm of a city in motion. Then came the call that made the hair on his arms stand up. All units in Sector 3 be advised. Report of a possible vehicle theft in progress at the parking lot of the Oak Creek Shopping Center near the entrance to the Daily Grind coffee shop. Caller reports a suspicious individual. Elias's grip on the steering wheel tightened almost imperceptibly. It was a standard call, the kind that came in a dozen times a week. But he waited, his breath held, for the detail he knew was coming. The dispatcher's voice, professional and detached, continued, "Suspect is described as a black male, late teens or early 20s, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. He is reportedly lingering around a late-model blue Lexus sedan." The words struck Elias like a physical blow. A black male, hoodie. It was the modern uniform of suspicion, the lazy shorthand that had replaced genuine description. The ghost of his own past, which had been a quiet companion just moments before, now roared to life in the confines of the car. He could feel the phantom sensation of handcuffs on his wrists, the memory of rough hands patting him down. 20 years had passed, but the script was chillingly the same. A different car, a different age, a different item of clothing, but the core element, the one that truly mattered to the caller and, he feared, to the responding officers, was identical. Sector 3, Unit 12, Officers Riley and Calloway responding. ETA 2 minutes, a voice crackled back. Riley and Calloway. Elias knew them. Not personally, not well, but by reputation. Calloway was young, barely 2 years on the force, eager but known for following the lead of his senior partner. Riley was the concern. A 10-year veteran with a reputation for being aggressive, for seeing every interaction as a nail to be hammered. He had a stack of citizen complaints that had all been internally cleared, but the pattern was there for anyone who cared to look. A tendency to escalate, not de-escalate. Elias made a decision. It was impulsive, unorthodox, and broke at least 3 departmental protocols about command staff responding to routine calls. He didn't care. This wasn't routine for him. This was personal. He flicked on his turn signal and smoothly merged into the lane heading away from headquarters and toward the Oak Creek Shopping Center. He didn't activate any lights or sirens. He drove his unmarked, dark gray sedan with the steady calm of any other commuter, but inside, his senses were on high alert. He wasn't responding as the chief of police. Not yet. He was responding as a witness, as an observer. He needed to see how his officers handled this. He needed to know if the culture he was trying so painstakingly to change had taken root, or if the weeds of old prejudices were still choking the life out of it. He imagined the scene already. The officers arriving with their assumptions preloaded, their body language confrontational, their questions framed as accusations. He hoped he was wrong. He prayed that he would arrive to see his officers engaged in a respectful, professional investigation. But the cold knot in his stomach told him otherwise. He was driving toward a mirror, a reflection of his own past, and he was terrified of what he was about to see. He wasn't just driving to a coffee shop parking lot, he was driving back 2 decades, into the heart of the moment that had redefined his life, and he had to know if anything at all, had changed. 20 years earlier. The sun was warmer, the kind of brilliant, optimistic light that made the city feel full of promise. A 32-year-old Elias Vance sat behind the wheel of his brand-new BMW 5 Series, the silver paint so pristine it seemed to hold the sunlight captive. The car was more than just a machine, it was a testament. It was a 4-wheeled declaration of arrival, a symbol of long nights, hard work, and the quiet triumph of a man who had built his dreams from the ground up. The interior smelled of rich Dakota leather and the faint, clean scent of the wood trim. Jazz flowed from the speakers, a smooth, complex melody that mirrored the intricate lines of the blueprints he'd just delivered to a high-profile client. He had just left a successful meeting, the client's enthusiastic approval still ringing in his ears. Life was good. Life was ordered. He had pulled into the parking lot of a small, upscale market in a wealthy suburban enclave to pick up a bottle of wine to celebrate. He'd told his wife, Sarah, that he would be home soon. He was parked, engine off, checking his messages on a clunky pre-smartphone PDA, a small smile on his face. He felt a profound sense of satisfaction, the kind of deep contentment that comes from seeing a difficult path lead to a beautiful destination. He was proud of the car, proud of his new architectural firm, proud of the life he was building. He was so absorbed in his own quiet joy that he was completely oblivious to the fact that he was being watched. He didn't notice the curtains twitching in the window of the boutique across the street. He didn't see the two figures who had stopped their own unloading of groceries to stare at him. In his mind, he was just a man sitting in his car. He was Elias Vance, architect, husband, son, a man who paid his taxes, mentored young draftsmen, and could spend hours debating the merits of cantilevered design. But in the eyes of the people who were watching him, he was none of those things. He was an anomaly, an incongruous detail in their carefully curated landscape. To them, the sight of a black man in a high-end luxury car didn't compute. It didn't fit their internal algorithm of how the world was supposed to work. In their minds, the car and the man were a mismatch, and in the small, dark space of that cognitive dissonance, suspicion was born. He finished his message, slid the PDA back into his briefcase on the passenger seat, and reached for the door handle. It was in that simple, mundane moment, as he prepared to step out of his car to buy a bottle of celebratory Merlot, that his world began to tilt on its axis. He was unaware that a phone call had already been made, a seed of prejudice already planted. He was sitting inside a polished silver cage, a symbol of his success that was about to become the very evidence used against him. The jazz music was still playing, a soundtrack to a life that was about to be irrevocably interrupted. He was about to learn that in some places, under some gazes, success wasn't a shield. It was a target. And the cage, no matter how beautifully appointed, was still a cage. Chad and Brittany considered themselves good people, progressive even. They had a Black Lives Matter sign in their meticulously landscaped yard. They donated to the right charities, and they always made a point to talk about diversity at their dinner parties. At 29 and 27, they were the very picture of modern, conscientious affluence, which is why they would have been horrified if someone had called their actions prejudiced. In their minds, they were simply being vigilant, responsible. They were unloading organic groceries from their own luxury SUV when they first saw him. The silver BMW was parked a few spaces away. It was the car they noticed first, sleek, expensive, the kind Chad had been eyeing for himself. Then they saw the man inside. He wasn't doing anything overtly criminal. He was just sitting there, looking at a small electronic device. But he was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, not the suit and tie they associated with the owners of such vehicles. And he was black.
That's weird,
Chad murmured to Brittany, his voice a low hum of disapproval. He subtly gestured with his chin. See that guy? He's been sitting there for like 10 minutes. Brittany glanced over, her brow furrowing with a manufactured concern. In that car? What do you think he's doing? Her tone wasn't one of genuine curiosity, but of prejudged suspicion. It was the tone someone uses when they've already decided the answer. I don't know. Casing the place? Waiting for someone to leave their car unlocked? Chad's imagination, fueled by a lifetime of curated media portrayals and unspoken biases, began to construct a narrative. The man wasn't resting after a meeting. He was waiting for an opportunity. The expensive car wasn't his, it was his target. People get their cars stolen from this lot all the time, he added, a statement with no basis in fact, but one that felt true in the moment. It justified the unease that was coiling in his stomach. He just doesn't fit, Brittany said, articulating the core of their discomfort. It wasn't about an action, it was about a presence. His existence in their space, in that car, was a disruption of their expected reality. It was a puzzle piece from the wrong box, and it made them deeply uncomfortable. They watched as Elias put his device away and reached for his door. To an objective observer, he was simply about to exit his vehicle. To Chad and Brittany, this was the moment the crime was about to happen. This was their cue to act, to be the heroes of their own small suburban drama. "Should we call someone?" Brittany whispered, clutching her purse. Chad puffed out his chest, a self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood. "I think we have to. It's our duty. What if he steals that car and it belongs to one of our neighbors? We'd never forgive ourselves." The logic was flimsy, a transparent rationalization for a decision already made in their gut. It wasn't about protecting a neighbor. It was about resolving their own cognitive dissonance. It was about restoring their sense of order. Chad pulled out his new top-of-the-line cell phone and dialed 911. As the operator answered, he lowered his voice, adopting a tone of urgent gravity. "Yes, hello. I'd like to report a suspicious person at the Highland Creek Market," he said. "There's a man, a black man, in a silver BMW. It looks like he's about to try and steal it. He's been acting very strangely." He omitted that the man had been doing nothing more than sitting quietly. He omitted that his suspicion was based on nothing more than a feeling, a prejudice he would never admit to having. He was just reporting the facts as his biased mind had interpreted them. From their safe, privileged vantage point, they watched as Elias got out of his car, completely unaware that the wheels of a great injustice, wheels they had just set in motion, were beginning to turn. They weren't bad people, they told themselves. They were just being safe. Chief Elias Vance pulled his unmarked sedan into a parking spot 2 rows away from the daily grind, positioning himself with a clear, unobstructed view of the scene unfolding. The first thing he saw was the blue Lexus, a gleaming, expensive piece of machinery that screamed success. The second thing he saw were his officers, Riley and Calloway, standing on either side of a young man who was leaning against the driver's side door. And his heart sank. The scene was so uncannily similar to his own memory that it felt like a waking nightmare. The young man, Leo, he would later learn, was the picture of calm defiance. He was tall and slender, probably around 21 or 22, wearing a simple gray hoodie, dark jeans, and clean sneakers. His hands were held out, palms slightly up, in a universal gesture of non-aggression. His expression was one of weary frustration, not fear. He was trying to explain, his voice too low for Elias to hear, but his body language speaking volumes. He was not a threat. The officers, however, were treating him as one. Riley, the senior partner, stood with his feet planted wide, his posture a study in confrontation. His hand was resting on his holstered taser, a casual but unmistakable display of menace. His questions, even from a distance, were visibly sharp and accusatory, punctuated by short, aggressive jabs of his finger. Calloway, the younger officer, mirrored his partner's stance, but with a nervous energy that made him seem even more unpredictable. He was flanking the young man, limiting his potential for movement, treating the parking lot like a tactical battlefield. Standing a few feet away, near a white minivan, were the accusers, a man and a woman, both in their late 30s, radiating an aura of smug self-righteousness. The woman was holding her phone, her face pinched with a theatrical concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. The man stood with his arms crossed, nodding emphatically at whatever Officer Riley was saying, playing the role of the validated, responsible citizen. They were the modern-day Chad and Brittany, the catalysts who had lit the fuse and were now watching with satisfaction, eager for the explosion. Elias felt a cold dread creep up his spine. His officers had failed the very first test of good policing. They had not secured the scene and separated the parties. Instead of questioning the accusers and the accused separately to get untainted accounts, they had created an echo chamber of accusation. They were standing shoulder to shoulder with the callers, allowing their narrative to be the unquestioned foundation of the entire interaction. They hadn't run the license plate. He knew they hadn't because they would have approached the young man differently if they had. They hadn't asked for the accuser's identification. They had done nothing but zero in on the target provided by the 911 call, a black male, hoodie. He watched as Leo calmly reached into his pocket, and Calloway immediately tensed, his hand moving toward his own weapon. Leo froze, then slowly pulled out a set of keys, dangling the Lexus fob from his finger. He said something, gesturing from the key to the car. It was a simple, logical demonstration of ownership. From the officer's reaction, it clearly did nothing to sway them. Elias felt a surge of anger, hot and familiar. He was witnessing a systemic failure in real time. This wasn't an investigation, it was a harassment. It was a public shaming based on a flimsy, prejudiced report. His men were not peacekeepers or investigators. In this moment, they were bullies with badges, and their victim was a young man who looked hauntingly like a younger version of Elias himself. He kept his hands on the steering wheel, forcing himself to remain an observer for just a moment longer. He had to see how far they would take it. He had to know the full depth of the rot before he could begin the work of cutting it out. From his car, Elias could now hear the clipped, aggressive tone of Officer Riley's voice carrying on the morning air. He was no longer just asking questions, he was cross-examining. "So you're telling us this is your car?" Riley said, his voice dripping with disbelief. He gestured at the pristine Lexus. "This is a $60,000 car. What does a kid like you do for a living that you can afford something like this?" Elias closed his eyes for a brief second. It was the question. The same corrosive, insidious question he had been asked 20 years ago. It was never, "Is this your car?" but, "How could this possibly be your car?" The question wasn't designed to gather facts. It was a challenge to the young man's very legitimacy. It was an accusation disguised as an inquiry. The young man, Leo, answered with a remarkable degree of patience. "Sir, my occupation has nothing to do with this. The car belongs to my father. I'm a student at Northwood University, and I'm borrowing it to pick up some books for a class. The registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. My student ID is in my wallet. I can show you all of it." He was offering them a clear, simple path to the truth. Verifiable information. The standard operating procedure for any legitimate traffic stop or ownership dispute. But the officers were completely uninterested. "Your father's car, huh?" Calloway chimed in with a smirk, trying to emulate his partner's cynical tone. "That's a convenient story. How do we know you didn't just take it without his permission?" "You could call him," Leo replied, his voice still even. "His name is Dr. Andreas Cole. He's a professor at the same university. You could also, as I've suggested twice now, run the license plate. It will come back to him." Elias watched, his jaw tightening. Leo was doing everything right. He was calm, he was articulate, and he was repeatedly offering them the tools to resolve the situation peacefully and factually. And the officers were actively refusing to use them. They were stuck on a narrative of guilt, a story they had co-authored with the accusers, and they were rejecting any evidence that contradicted it. The investigation had been derailed by their own confirmation bias before it had even begun. The male accuser, emboldened by the officer's line of questioning, stepped forward. "He's being evasive, officers, see? He's talking in circles. A straight answer would be simple. He's trying to confuse you." Riley nodded at the man, a gesture of validation. He didn't correct him. He didn't tell him to step back and let them handle it. He allowed the civilian's biased commentary to become part of the official police interrogation. "The man has a point," Riley said to Leo. "You're being defensive, and that makes you look guilty. Innocent people cooperate." "I am cooperating," Leo countered, a spark of frustration finally entering his voice. "I am standing here answering your questions while being accused of something I didn't do. I've offered you proof of ownership and my identification. You seem to be the ones who aren't interested in cooperation. You're interested in being right." The accusation hung in the air, a direct challenge to Riley's authority. Elias saw the flicker in the officer's eyes, the flash of anger that comes when a person in power is confronted with an uncomfortable truth. He wasn't just dealing with a suspect anymore. He was dealing with someone who understood the game, someone who refused to be passively intimidated. and for an officer like Riley, that was unforgivable. He had approached the scene not to investigate a crime, but to confirm a prejudice. And in the face of logic and reason, he was now defaulting to the only tool he had left: pure, unadulterated intimidation. The entire interaction, Elias knew, was a textbook example of what not to do. It was a case study in bias-driven policing, and he was watching his own men fail the test in the most spectacular way imaginable. The officer who had responded to Chad's 911 call 20 years ago was a man named Miller. He was in his late 30s with a thick neck and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl of suspicion. He had approached Elias not with questions, but with commands. He had completely ignored Elias's attempts to explain that the silver BMW was his, that he had the key in his hand and the registration in his glove box. Miller had eyes only for Chad and Brittany, who stood on the sidelines, pointing and nodding, their faces masks of civic concern.
We saw him, officer,
Chad had said, his voice booming with newfound authority now that he had backup. He was acting real shifty, just sitting in the car, looking around. We knew something was up. Miller had absorbed their story without a flicker of skepticism. To him, it was an open and shut case. The two well-dressed white witnesses were credible. The black man with the luxury car was the suspect. The mental math was simple and brutal. "Sir, I'm going to need you to put your hands on the hood of the car," Miller had commanded. "Officer, with all due respect, you don't need to do that," Elias had said, his voice a pillar of calm he did not feel. "This is my car. My name is Elias Vance. I'm an architect. I can show you my ID and the vehicle registration. There's no need for this." This assertion of his rights, this refusal to immediately prostrate himself, was seen not as a sign of innocence, but as an act of defiance. To Miller, an innocent man would be scared and compliant. Confidence was tantamount to guilt. "I'm not going to ask you again," Miller had growled. "Hands on the car, now!" Before Elias could fully process the command, Miller had closed the distance between them. He grabbed Elias's arm, twisting it behind his back with a painful, practiced efficiency. The sudden, unexpected violence of the act sent a jolt of shock through Elias's system. He was not a fighter. He had never been in a physical altercation in his life. He instinctively tensed, a natural reaction to being assaulted, which Miller immediately interpreted as resistance. "Stop resisting!" Miller yelled, his voice loud enough for the growing number of onlookers to hear. He slammed Elias's body against the side of the BMW, the impact knocking the wind out of him. The beautiful, polished silver door he had been so proud of was now an instrument of his humiliation. Miller forced him down, his knee pressing hard into Elias's back until his face was pressed against the hot, gritty asphalt of the parking lot. The smell of tar and exhaust filled his nostrils. The world became a dizzying, terrifying blur of gray pavement and black police boots. He felt the cold, unforgiving steel of the handcuffs bite into his wrists. The metallic clicks echoed in the quiet lot, each one a sound of finality, stripping him of his dignity, his identity, his humanity. He was no longer Elias Vance, architect. He was a suspect, a criminal, a black male in a hoodie, or in his case a polo shirt, who fit the description. He was lifted to his feet and shoved into the back of the patrol car, the cage door slamming shut behind him. Through the window he saw Chad and Brittany watching, their expressions not of triumph, but of a kind of queasy, uncomfortable validation. They had done their civic duty, and in doing so they had shattered a man's world. In the present, the scene at the Oak Creek Shopping Center was reaching a terrifyingly familiar boiling point. Officer Riley, his face flushed with anger at Leo's articulate defiance, had exhausted his limited capacity for dialogue. He was losing control of the narrative, not just with Leo, but with the small crowd of onlookers that had begun to form. People leaving the coffee shop, phones held up discreetly, were now silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Public scrutiny was an irritant Riley could not tolerate. "All right, I've had enough of your lip," Riley announced, his voice rising in volume. He saw Leo's calm as insolence, his knowledge of his rights as obstruction. You've been asked to cooperate and you've done nothing but argue. You're interfering with my investigation. What investigation? Leo shot back, his composure finally cracking. You haven't checked a single fact. You haven't run my plate. You haven't looked at my ID. You are harassing me based on their word. He gestured with his head toward the accusers. And you know it. That was the final straw. For Riley, being called out so plainly, so publicly, was an unforgivable offense. The truth of Leo's words was irrelevant. The challenge to his authority was everything. He unclipped the handcuffs from his belt. The sound, a sharp plastic and metal click, was sickeningly familiar to Elias. It was the point of no return. It was the moment a verbal confrontation became a physical assault under the color of law. That's it, Riley declared. You're under arrest. Turn around, hands behind your back. Arrest for what? Leo demanded, standing his ground. You have to tell me what crime I've committed. Obstruction! Failure to cooperate! Calloway supplied eagerly, stepping forward to flank Leo more aggressively. They moved in sync, a practiced dance of intimidation, ready to converge and overwhelm him. Elias Vance felt a cold, clear certainty settle over him. He had seen enough. He had remained an observer, a ghost watching a play he already knew the ending to. But he was not a ghost. He was the chief of police, and the ending to this play was not going to be the same. He could not, in good conscience, sit by and watch a young man be arrested, or worse, for the crime of being black in his father's car. He could not allow his officers to cross that line, to inflict that trauma, to perpetuate the very cycle of injustice he had dedicated his life to breaking. His hand moved from the steering wheel to the door handle. The quiet click as he opened the door was his own point of no return. The ghost was about to step into the light. The observer was about to become a participant. Every instinct he had honed as a police officer told him that his intervention would be unpredictable, that it would escalate the situation before it could de-escalate it. His own officers, their adrenaline pumping and their biases fully engaged, would not see him as a superior. They would see him as another threat. He knew the risk, and he accepted it. He stepped out of the unmarked sedan, the heavy door closing with a solid, definitive thud. The sound cut through the tense atmosphere in the parking lot, and for the first time, every head, Leo's, Riley's, Calloway's, the accusers, the onlookers, turned toward him. The line had been drawn, and he was about to cross it. Elias Vance walked toward the scene with a measured, deliberate pace. He was dressed in simple charcoal gray slacks and a black quarter-zip pullover, the civilian attire of a commander, not a beat cop. His hands were empty and held in plain sight, away from his body. His posture was relaxed but erect, radiating an aura of calm authority that was in stark contrast to the coiled tension of the two officers. He moved like a man who belonged, a man who was in control of himself and his surroundings. His own officers, however, did not see a commander. They saw a middle-aged black man purposefully approaching a volatile police scene. In their adrenalized state, their minds, already clouded by bias, processed his approach through the only filter they had left: threat assessment. "Sir, you need to stay back," Calloway yelled, turning his attention from Leo to Elias. He immediately took a defensive stance, positioning himself between Elias and his partner. "This is an active police investigation. Do not come any closer." Elias didn't stop, but he slowed his pace, coming to a halt about 15 feet away. He made no sudden moves. He simply stood and met their gaze. "There doesn't appear to be much of an investigation going on, officer," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone that carried easily in the quiet lot. It was not the voice of an agitator. It was the voice of an evaluator. The unexpected response and the calm confidence with which it was delivered seemed to further agitate Officer Riley. He saw it as a challenge, an attempt to undermine him in front of the public. "I said stay back," Riley barked, turning his body to face Elias more directly. "This doesn't concern you. Get back in your car and leave, or you'll be arrested for obstruction, too." The threat was absurd, a naked display of ego. Elias had not interfered, he had not threatened, he had simply spoken. The accusers watched with wide eyes, a new wave of validation washing over them. In their minds, this newcomer was likely an accomplice, a friend of the car thief, arriving to cause more trouble. The male accuser even gestured toward Elias and said loudly to Calloway, "See? What did I tell you? They're coming out of the woodwork now." Elias ignored them all. His focus was solely on his two officers. He was giving them a chance, a final opportunity to recognize their own procedural failures, to de-escalate on their own. He was testing them. "Officer," Elias said, addressing Riley directly, his tone still even, almost academic. "You are about to make an arrest without probable cause. You have been provided with a simple means to verify this young man's story, running the license plate, and have failed to do so. You have allowed civilian commentary to dictate the course of your inquiry. You are escalating a situation that requires no escalation. I'm suggesting you rethink your course of action." This calm, articulate deconstruction of his professional failings was more infuriating to Riley than any shouted insult could have been. It was a direct hit to his pride and his authority. He saw a lecturer, not a concerned citizen. "You think you know my job better than me?" Riley sneered, taking a confrontational step toward Elias. "You have no idea what you're talking about. This is your final warning. Leave. Now!" Elias Vance held his ground. He was no longer just the chief of police. He was a citizen, standing in a parking lot, being threatened with arrest by his own subordinate for daring to speak the truth. The irony was bitter, but the resolve it gave him was like steel. The test was over. They had failed. Instead of retreating, Elias took a single, deliberate step forward, closing the distance slightly. The move was not aggressive, but it was a clear refusal to be intimidated. His voice remained a calm, unwavering force against the officer's rising agitation. "I know that Northwood Police Department policy, specifically Section 4, subsection 12B, dictates that in any suspected property crime dispute where ownership can be easily verified by digital or physical documentation, that action must be the primary step in the investigation," Elias stated. "You have neglected to do that." Officers Riley and Calloway exchanged a brief, confused glance. It was one thing to be challenged by a citizen. It was another to have their own department's policy manual quoted back to them verbatim in a parking lot. "Who the hell are you?" Calloway asked, his youthful bravado faltering into genuine bewilderment. Elias ignored the question, keeping his focus on Riley, who was the senior officer and the driver of the confrontation. "I also know that Policy 7.03, regarding officer conduct, demands that officers maintain a professional and impartial demeanor. Your line of questioning regarding that young man's financial status," he gestured toward Leo, "is a clear violation of that impartiality. It constitutes bias-based profiling." Riley's face, which had been flushed with anger, was now beginning to show shades of uncertainty. This man didn't talk like any civilian he had ever encountered. The precision of his language, the confident citation of policy, it was unsettling. It was the language of lawyers, of internal affairs investigators, of command staff. "Furthermore," Elias continued, his voice like that of a professor dissecting a failed experiment, "you failed to separate the primary parties, allowing the complainants to contaminate the scene and influence your actions, a direct violation of basic investigative procedure taught on day one at the academy. You have made no attempt to de-escalate. Instead, you have met this young man's calm and cooperative demeanor with increasing hostility, culminating in a threat of arrest for obstruction, when in fact it is your own investigation that is being obstructed by your refusal to follow fundamental protocol." Every sentence was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing Riley's inflated sense of authority. He had no response. To argue would be to admit he didn't know his own policies. To remain silent was to concede the point. He was trapped by his own incompetence, and the calm stranger was the one who had sprung the trap. The male accuser, feeling the dynamic of the scene shifting away from him, tried to jump back in. Listen to him. He's a professional agitator. He's trying to trick you with big words. This time, Elias turned his gaze on the man. It was a cold, analytical look, devoid of anger but heavy with appraisal. Sir, your opinion has been noted and is at this point irrelevant to the procedural failures we are discussing. He turned back to Riley. So I will ask you again, officer. Given that you have no probable cause, that you have failed to conduct a basic investigation, and that your actions appear to be driven by bias rather than fact, on what grounds do you believe you have the authority to place that citizen, he pointed to Leo, or me, under arrest? The question hung in the air, a final, unanswerable challenge. Riley stood speechless, his hand hovering uselessly near the handcuffs on his belt. The crowd was silent, watching the stunning verbal reversal of power. The two officers who had held all the power just minutes before were now being held accountable by an unknown man who wielded the rules better than they did. Their authority had evaporated, dismantled not by force, but by a calm, irrefutable recitation of the truth. The standoff was absolute. Officers Riley and Calloway were frozen, their playbook empty, their authority stripped bare by a man who had used nothing but their own regulations against them. Riley, a man accustomed to dominating every interaction, could only stare, his mind racing to categorize the stranger before him. An ACLU lawyer? An off-duty detective from another precinct? Nothing made sense. "I want your name and badge number," Riley finally stammered, falling back on a citizen's tactic in a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control. "Both of you." Elias allowed a moment of silence to pass, letting the weight of the request settle. He looked from Riley's stunned face to Calloway's pale, sweat-slicked one. He glanced at Leo, who was watching with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He saw the accusers, their smug certainty having curdled into confused apprehension. He reached slowly into the back pocket of his slacks and pulled out a simple black leather wallet. It was not a sudden movement, but every eye was fixed on it as if it were a weapon. He didn't open it to show a driver's license. Instead, he flipped it open to reveal the polished, recessed badge and the official identification card that sat opposite it. He held it up for them to see, the gold shield catching a glint of the morning sun. "You can have more than that," he said, his voice dropping the last vestiges of academic detachment and settling into one of quiet, absolute command. "Officer Riley, you can have my full name. It's Elias Vance." He took a step closer, ensuring they could read the credentials clearly. He saw the exact moment the information registered in Riley's eyes. The flicker of confusion, the widening of disbelief, and then the sickening, gut-wrenching dawn of pure, unadulterated horror. Calloway's jaw literally dropped. He took an involuntary step back, his face a mask of white-hot panic. Elias let the name hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final, devastating blow. "And my title," he said, his voice as calm and clear as a bell, "is Chief of Police." The words detonated in the quiet parking lot. If his previous statements had been darts, this was a cannonball, shattering the entire foundation of the scene. The male accuser let out a short, choked laugh of disbelief. "Chief? Yeah, right. Nice try, buddy." But he fell silent as he saw the faces of the two officers. They looked as if they had seen a ghost. Riley's entire body had gone rigid, the color draining from his face, leaving a pasty gray pallor. The handcuffs he had been so eager to use slipped from his numb fingers and clattered onto the asphalt with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire lot. "Sir, Chief, we..." Riley's voice was a strangled whisper. He could not form a coherent sentence. His entire world, his career, his understanding of the last 10 minutes had been turned completely upside down. Elias slid his wallet back into his pocket. He turned his head slightly to address the younger officer who looked like he was about to be physically ill. "Officer Calloway," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Take those handcuffs off your belt and put them away. Now!" Calloway fumbled with the clasp, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to secure the cuffs back in their pouch. The balance of power had not just shifted. It had undergone a seismic, irreversible reversal. The man they had threatened, the man they had dismissed as an agitator, the man they had profiled as a criminal accomplice, was the ultimate authority. He was their boss, and they had just given him the most damning performance review of their entire lives. The holding cell 20 years ago was cold, not just in temperature, but in spirit. It was a concrete box designed to strip away identity, to reduce a person to a number and a charge. Elias sat on the hard metal bench, the humiliation he'd felt in the parking lot having cooled into a slow-burning rage. The charge was resisting arrest and suspicion of grand theft auto. Both were lies, flimsy justifications for an arrest born of prejudice. They had eventually run his license and registration at the station, of course. The car came back clean, registered in his name, but that didn't matter. Officer Miller, needing to save face, had manufactured the resisting charge to validate the violent takedown. Elias was left to sit for 6 agonizing hours. 6 hours for the system to process his innocence, an innocence that should have been obvious from the start. In the silence of that cell, broken only by the distant shouts of other detainees and the jangle of guards' keys, something inside him began to change. The anger was there, a white-hot core of it. But beneath it, a question began to form. What now? He could sue. He could file a complaint that would likely go nowhere. Or he could let the anger consume him, turning him bitter and cynical. When he was finally released, the charges dropped with a dismissive shrug from the desk sergeant. He walked out into the pre-dawn darkness. His father was waiting for him. A retired history teacher, Samuel Vance was a man of quiet strength and profound wisdom. He didn't ask what happened. He just put a hand on his son's shoulder and waited. They sat in his father's old, comfortable sedan, the engine off, the silence a sanctuary. "They put me on the ground, Dad," Elias said, his voice cracking for the first time. "In front of everyone, like I was nothing." Samuel listened, his gaze fixed on the quiet, sleeping houses of the city. When Elias finished, his father turned to him. "You have every right to be angry, son," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "That anger is a fire. You can let it burn you down. Or you can take that fire, put it in a furnace, and use it to forge something." "Forge what?" Elias asked, the bitterness thick in his voice. "A lawsuit they'll laugh out of court?" "No," Samuel said, looking his son directly in the eye. "Something stronger, something that lasts. You're an architect, Elias. You build things. You see a flaw in a design and you fix it. You just found a catastrophic flaw in the design of this system. They have the power to do this to you, to anyone who looks like you, because they are the ones with the uniform and the badge. So what do you do?" The implication was terrifying and radical. It was a path so contrary to everything Elias had planned for his life that it seemed impossible. But the seed was planted. The idea that the only way to truly fix a broken system was not to attack it from the outside, but to rebuild it from within. "You can't be serious," Elias whispered. "I am," his father replied. "Don't let them turn you into a victim. Don't let them make you hate the uniform. Take their power, Elias. Take it and use it for good. Use it so that 20 years from now, another young man in his own car doesn't have his face pressed into the asphalt because of who he is. Build a better structure. That's what you do." In the quiet darkness of his father's car, in the aftermath of his deepest humiliation, the fire of Elias's anger found its furnace. He would not be a victim. He would not be consumed by hate. He would become an architect of a different kind. He would build a shield. Back in the sun-drenched parking lot, the fallout from the chief's revelation was swift and absolute. Chief Elias Vance turned his attention first to Leo, who was still leaning against the Lexus, his expression a stunned mixture of relief and disbelief. Elias's own demeanor softened as he addressed the young man. "Young man, what's your name?" he asked, his voice calm and respectful. "Leo, sir. Leo Cole." "Well, Leo, on behalf of the Northwood Police Department, I want to formally apologize for what you have just been subjected to. Elias said, his voice clear and loud enough for everyone, including the onlookers and his officers, to hear. You have done nothing wrong. You conducted yourself with a patience and a composure that is frankly remarkable under the circumstances. You are free to go. Leo nodded, still seemingly processing the sudden reversal of fortune. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Before you leave, Elias added, I'd like to have a brief word with you if you have a moment. Just over here. He gestured to a quiet spot away from the others. He would not let this young man leave feeling like a mere pawn in a larger drama. He then turned his gaze back to Riley and Calloway. The look in his eyes was no longer that of a commander. It was the cold, impersonal gaze of an internal affairs investigator. Officers Riley and Calloway, he said, his voice flat and hard as granite. You will go stand by your patrol vehicle. You will not speak to each other. You will not use your phones. You will not deactivate your body cameras. You will wait for a supervisor from Internal Affairs to arrive on scene to take your statements and escort you back to headquarters. Is that understood? Yes, Chief, Riley mumbled, his eyes fixed on the ground. He couldn't bring himself to look at the man he had just threatened to arrest. Yes, Chief, Calloway echoed, his voice barely a squeak. The two officers, once the unquestioned authority in this space, trudged back to their car in a walk of shame, their movements stiff and robotic. They looked like defeated soldiers on a battlefield of their own making. With his officers sidelined, Elias turned his full, undivided attention to the two accusers. The couple stood frozen, the gravity of their situation finally dawning on them. The woman was clutching the man's arm, her face ashen with terror. The man's blustering confidence had completely vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed panic. They were no longer helpful witnesses. They were the perpetrators of a malicious false report against the city's highest-ranking law enforcement officer. Elias approached them slowly, his notepad and pen, the tools of his old life as a detective, now in his hand. I believe you two are the ones who initiated this call, he said. It was not a question. It was a mistake, the man stammered, his voice cracking. An honest mistake. We just thought it looked suspicious. A mistake is dialing the wrong number, Elias countered, his voice dangerously quiet, echoing the words of a sergeant he had once known. What you did was make a conscious decision to report a potential felony based on nothing more than your own prejudice. You lied to the 911 operator. You told them this young man was acting suspiciously when he was doing nothing of the sort. Your mistake nearly resulted in the unlawful arrest and potential injury of an innocent citizen. Your mistake is a crime. He held their terrified gaze. I'm going to need your identification, both of you. A detective from the district attorney's office will be in contact with you shortly to schedule your formal interviews. I would strongly advise you to retain legal counsel. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Their suburban drama was over. Their legal nightmare was just beginning. Before getting back into his own car, Elias walked over to where Leo was waiting by his Lexus. The young man stood straighter now, the weary defiance in his posture replaced by a quiet respect. The crowd of onlookers had begun to disperse, sensing the climax was over, their hushed chatter filling the air as they shared the unbelievable story they had just witnessed. Are you all right, Leo? Elias asked, his voice losing its official hardness and taking on a gentler, more paternal tone. I am now, Leo said, letting out a long, shaky breath. That was intense. I've been pulled over before, but never anything like that. I really thought they were going to arrest me. They were, Elias stated simply, and they would have if things had been different. He leaned against the car next to Leo, creating a small space of shared confidence. He wasn't just Chief Vance anymore, he was Elias, a man who saw a reflection of himself in the young man's eyes. I want you to know something, Elias said, looking not at Leo but out at the parking lot, as if seeing a ghost from the past. What happened to you today? The questions they asked, the assumptions they made. It wasn't about you. It wasn't about the car or the hoodie. It was about their own failures, their own biases. It was wrong, and it had nothing to do with who you are. Leo nodded, absorbing the words. I know, but it's hard not to take it personally when they're pointing at you. I understand that more than you know, Elias said. He hesitated for a moment, then made the decision to share a piece of the story he rarely told. 20 years ago, not far from here, I was 32 years old. I was an architect, and I had just bought my first really nice car, a silver BMW. I was so proud of that car. He paused, the memory still sharp. And I was pulled out of it, handcuffed, and put in the back of a police car for stealing it. I was arrested by officers who saw the same thing your accusers and these officers saw today. A man who didn't fit their idea of who should have a car like that. Leo's eyes widened in understanding. The shared experience created an instant, unspoken bond between them, a bridge connecting two generations who had walked the same painful path. You're kidding me, Leo whispered. That's why I'm here, Elias finished for him. It's why I wear this badge. I didn't want my anger over what happened to me to be the end of the story. I wanted to make sure it couldn't happen to anyone else. We're not there yet, clearly, but we're trying. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. What you did today, staying calm, knowing your rights, refusing to be intimidated, that took incredible strength. Don't ever lose that. But you shouldn't have had to be that strong just to sit in your father's car in a parking lot. That's on us to fix. He pulled a business card from his wallet. It had his direct line on it. If you ever need anything at all, or if you ever feel like you're not being heard, you call me directly. My door is always open. Leo took the card, looking at it with a sense of awe. A moment of shared trauma had been transformed into a moment of mentorship, of hope. He looked at the chief, the man who had turned his own scar into a shield for others, and for the first time that morning, he smiled. Thank you, Chief. Really, thank you. By the time Elias Vance arrived at his office, the official gears of the department were already grinding into motion with a speed reserved for only the most critical incidents. His brief, pointed call to the on-duty captain from his car had set off a firestorm. The phrase, Code 100 incident involving command staff, had lit up the internal communications network. Captain Isabella Rossi, the uncompromising head of the Office of Professional Standards, Internal Affairs, had already secured the patrol car of Officers Riley and Calloway and was personally pulling the body camera footage. She and Elias had come up through the ranks together, and she shared his unyielding commitment to accountability. There would be no favoritism, no sweeping this under the rug. Within hours, Rossi had her preliminary report on Elias's desk. The evidence was even more damning than he had witnessed. The body camera footage was a textbook example of bias-driven policing. It captured every condescending question from Riley, every smug smirk from Calloway, every calm and logical response from Leo, and every refusal by the officers to perform a basic license plate check. The audio clearly recorded the accuser's inflammatory and baseless comments, and the officers' open validation of them. Most critically, it captured Elias's own calm intervention and Riley's unambiguous threat to arrest him for obstruction. It was an open and shut case of gross misconduct. The 911 call was pulled next. The audio was transcribed and cross-referenced with the video. The caller, the man with the minivan, had told the dispatcher that Leo was acting erratically and looked like he was about to break into the car. The video evidence showed a young man sitting calmly, looking at his phone. The lie was blatant and malicious. Simultaneously, a formal report of the incident, compiled by the responding IA supervisor, was sent to the Oak Ridge County District Attorney's Office. District Attorney Anya Sharma, a prosecutor with a reputation for aggressively pursuing cases of public integrity and abuse of the justice system, reviewed the file herself. The victim's identity made it a high-priority case, but the crystal-clear evidence made it a prosecutor's dream. Within 48 hours, the initial consequences were delivered. Officers Riley and Calloway were summoned to Captain Rossi's sterile office. They were formally notified that they were the subjects of an internal investigation for violations including bias-based policing, failure to follow procedure, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. They were placed on immediate, unpaid administrative leave. Their badges and service weapons were confiscated, and they were escorted from the building, their careers effectively over. The police union would file a token grievance, but they both knew it was hopeless. The evidence was irrefutable. The following week, the DA's office acted. Warrants were issued for the arrest of the two accusers, Mark and Karen Fields. They were charged with filing a false police report and maliciously summoning an emergency response. Their mugshots, a stark contrast to their smug self-assurance in the parking lot, were released to the media along with a scathing press release from DA Sharma about the dangers of using the 911 system as a weapon for personal prejudice. The machinery of accountability, once set in motion, was proving to be both swift and merciless. For Elias, it was not about revenge. It was about restoration. It was a clear and unequivocal message to his department and his city. The rules apply to everyone, whether they wear a badge or make a phone call. In the weeks that followed, the firings of officers Riley and Calloway became a mere footnote to the sweeping changes Chief Elias Vance began to implement. He knew that removing two bad apples did nothing to address the health of the tree itself. The incident at the Oak Creek Shopping Center was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a deep, systemic illness. His own painful history, now mirrored in the experience of Leo Cole, was all the proof he needed. He convened a mandatory department-wide assembly. Every sworn officer, from the rawest rookie to the most seasoned captain, was present. On a large screen in the main auditorium, Elias played the unedited body camera footage from the incident. He didn't speak. He let the silent, grim-faced officers watch the slow-motion car crash of their colleagues' careers. They saw the biased questions, the procedural failures, the escalating aggression, and the final, humiliating reveal. When the video ended, the room was thick with a tense, uncomfortable silence. Elias stepped up to the podium. "What you just saw was a catastrophic failure at every level," he began, his voice quiet but resonant. "It was a failure of training, a failure of supervision, and a failure of character. The only reason that situation did not end in a tragedy, in a false arrest or worse, is because I happened to be the one who stepped out of that car. An ordinary citizen would not have been so lucky, and a citizen's constitutional rights should never, ever depend on luck." He looked out at the sea of blue uniforms. "As of today, we are implementing a new series of mandatory training modules and departmental policies. They will be known as the Vance Protocol." The protocol was a multi-pronged overhaul. It included intensive scenario-based de-escalation training that went far beyond the old online courses. It instituted a new duty to intervene policy with real teeth, making it a fireable offense for an officer to witness misconduct by a partner and do nothing. Most significantly, it established a new directive for all dispatched calls involving suspicious persons, where race was the primary descriptor. The new policy required dispatchers to ask for specific, observable criminal behaviors, and required responding officers to treat the encounter as an observation and verification call, not a presumptive criminal call, until actual probable cause was established. The body camera footage of the Leo Cole incident, along with a heavily redacted summary of Elias's own experience from 2 decades prior, became a permanent part of the academy curriculum for all new recruits. It would be a mandatory lesson in humility, a stark reminder of the human cost of bias. In the end, the story of what happened on that crisp autumn morning became more than just a cautionary tale. It became a catalyst. To truly understand its lessons, we must look beyond the firings and the new policies and into the complex, often uncomfortable territory of human psychology. What drove Mark and Karen Fields to weaponize a 911 call? It wasn't the mustache-twirling villainy of a movie. It was something far more common and therefore more dangerous. A quiet, unexamined prejudice. In their ordered world, the image of a young black man near a luxury car created a cognitive dissonance, a feeling of unease they couldn't tolerate. The 911 call was their way of resolving that discomfort, of forcibly restoring their version of order to the world by putting the out-of-place piece back in what they believed was its box. Their fear, whether genuine or performative, became the license they gave themselves to abandon reason. We must also ask the difficult what-if questions to appreciate the razor-thin margin between how this story ended and how it could have. What if Leo Cole hadn't possessed the remarkable composure he did? What if he had let his justifiable anger show, had raised his voice, had made a sudden move out of frustration? The officers were primed for a confrontation, actively seeking any excuse to validate their initial suspicion. A single misstep could have given them the justification they needed to use force, transforming the narrative from harassment to resisting arrest. What if Chief Vance hadn't been there? What if no one with the authority to stop the train wreck had been present? The story would have ended with a young man in handcuffs, his faith in the system shattered, facing charges born from a lie. The ultimate lesson here is one of profound and difficult hope. It reminds us that while prejudice is a powerful and destructive force, it is not invincible. It can be countered by accountability, integrity, and the courage to act. It shows us that true leadership is not about projecting power, but about having the wisdom and humility to remember what it feels like to be powerless. Chief Vance turned his deepest wound into a shield for others, transforming a personal injustice into a platform for systemic change. He didn't just punish the guilty. He sought to build a system where such guilt would have a harder time taking root. This story reminds us that the fight for justice is not won in a single, dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet, daily choices to challenge our own assumptions, to hold power accountable, and to see the humanity in others, even and especially when they don't fit our expectations. The story found a resolution, but countless others just like it do not. It begs us to consider what role we play in the stories unfolding around us every day. What would you have done if you were in that crowd? And what can we all do to ensure that a person's rights are never dependent on their job title, but are protected by the integrity of the uniform itself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice is crucial in keeping these important conversations alive.